Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk speaking. Now, first of all, thank you so very much for listening to the podcast. Now, I am very excited to let you know that the podcast is now available on Amazon Alexa. You know the drill. Simply say, Alexa, play Public Relations Review Podcast, and she'll take it from there. And again, thank you for listening. And if you enjoy the program, please become a subscriber. Now, on to the podcast.
Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review Podcast, a program to discuss the many facets of public relations with seasoned professionals, educators, authors, and others. Now, here is your host, Peter Woolfolk.
Welcome to the Public Relations Review Podcast and to our listeners all across America and around the world. Now, the coronavirus caused many public relations professionals to develop emergency plans to address this new and serious virus that is unfamiliar to most of us. How do you explain this virus to your target audience? How do you decide what your messages are and the best way to deliver them? Who do you contact to help you explain the impact of this onslaught? These and other questions were faced by my guest today. He is Marvin Stockwell, the Director of Media Relations at the nationally renowned St.Jude Children's Research Hospital, and he joins us today from Memphis, Tennessee. Marvin, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, tell us how you began to develop your appropriate messages for the various audiences that you have.
Well, it's important to note at the outset that no one could have foreseen the coronavirus pandemic, unless you're a virologist. And there are some that said it was inevitable. But in terms of your average person, there's no way to have foreseen exactly how this was going to manifest itself. And so, at St. Jude, we had to hit the pause button and say, what would a reasonable person expect a responsible organization like St. Jude to do in an instance like this, during this pandemic? And how can we be useful and helpful? It's really a reframing of that age-old PR maxim, but adapted for this crisis. Because it's not like a typical crisis PR situation where you're talking about an organizational crisis. We are all participants in a global crisis. This is everyone in the world's crisis. And so St. Jude had to do some internal work and say, how can we contribute? How can we be helpful to the world? And from my role as PR guy, I had to say, well, certain messages that were relevant just a couple of months ago have to be set aside. So, for instance, I was planning to go on to the AACR conference and talk to science journalists about the utility of St. Jude Cloud, our genomic sharing platform that we stood up with Microsoft a couple of years ago. Well, obviously, the world is focused on COVID-19. So we had to take a step back and say, what's useful to talk about? And that's driven by what is useful to do for the world. So the first thing that kind of gelled at St. Jude that I was able to publicize, our psychology staffers and child life specialists said, why don't we develop a coronavirus coloring book so that children ages 5 to 9 can work through their fears and anxieties about the pandemic with their parents? And that was originally hatched as an idea to serve our patients. But then those same staffers realized with a little bit of extra hustle, we can make it something that any child anywhere in the world could benefit from. So me as PR guy, I thought to myself, well, that's where you have a universal utility, and that's a great PR pitch. So I was able to get that covered in USA Today and Forbes and a bunch of other print outlets. And quite frankly, when you fold in the tween and teen corresponding resources, I've been doing press around those basically the entire length of the pandemic. And that's just one instance where the organizational nimbleness and flexibility gave rise to a corresponding PR pitch that got us great coverage and that held St. Jude up in great light.
Now, the coloring book, did you distribute this beyond Memphis? Was it just for Memphis? Or how did you handle that part of it when you started getting this exposure and the media exposure?
Well, We did do an actual print run for on campus in Memphis. But what we did for the wider utility is that we ended up translating it into 13 different languages and making it available as a free download. So children, and since then, the resources have been downloaded tens of thousands of times all across the world. And they're in Italian, they're in Portuguese, they're in Arabic. So it's a heartening thing for me, just as a person, to know that a work that was originally focused on serving our patients, which is job number one, was then, with a little bit of extra hustle, was made all that more useful to the world. And in doing so, they gave their swing for the fences PR guy, a great pitch, quite frankly. And to be able to hold that work up and know that not only am I getting coverage for St. Jude, which is my job, but that resource being used actually means that children are working through their fears and anxieties. Gosh, I mean, it's very gratifying to see that missional objective fulfilled on and know that my role increased its utility.
Mm-hmm. Now, even though you focus on children, did reporters call you and ask you questions as it applied to adults considering COVID?
Not so much as the disease is concerned, but however, it was absolutely useful to adults because, of course, all these children that we're helping also have parents that are wondering, gosh, what's appropriate developmentally to say to my child? And that, of course, that's a different thing for a child who's 5 and a child who's 13 or a child who's 17.
Right.
So we've equipped not only the children, but we've equipped those parents with tools.
So now when you say tools, exactly what did you help them do, or what did you provide them with, or what sort of educational experience did you give to them?
Sure. So with the little kids, ages 5 to 9, it's a coloring book. For your middle school age kids, they're more capable of understanding deeper things, right? So we created the tween resource to be more science heavy. Honestly, we've heard evidence that teachers also are pressing these materials into play. What more relevant thing could a science teacher during the pandemic have than something produced by St. Jude that helps tweens? And then the third resource was a teen resource. All those different resources are developmentally appropriate and built by child psychologists with that in mind, with the brain development in mind. So it was useful to children, it was useful to teens, it was useful to all of those children's parents, but it was also useful to educators because it's like, it's a broken play. My wife and I have 3 children ages 16, 13, and 9. So we saw how 3 different schools adapted to online education, so, and teachers had to throw out the rule book too, like we PR people had to stop on a dime and do different things and promote different things. But the teachers had to their lesson plan went out the window. Well, what they found was that here's this resource from St. Jude that's science, it's STEM education focused. And a lot of these teachers just pressed it right into play.
That brings up a good question. Did having the book, did it also cause particular teachers to ask you to maybe come in and speak to students, or your staff people come in and speak?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that happening. I will say that because it's a pandemic, those things probably would have happened in terms of like online or, like Zoom calls or whatever. And quite frankly, that's where our psychologists and child life specialists, their day in, day out duties are focused on the needs of our patients on campus in Memphis, which they have to communicate with via digital tools as well. I guess it's possible that they could have been made available to schools, but I'd say their focus was really on our patients. Yes, they flexed and did something that was more widely useful, but in the day in, day out reality, I'd say they would probably have to spend their time really focused on our patients. That's their primary job.
Have you, in this process or over this brief time period, have you run across people who are reluctant, if you will, to follow the message because maybe they don't want to put on a mask, or they don't want their kids to put them on because they are free to do what they, or as some people say, this is a free country, we can do what we please without fully understanding the implications for other people. Have you run across that yet?
Oh, sure. I mean, all you have to do is go out and engage the world, and you see all sorts of people disregarding the recommendations about mask wearing and social distancing. And yes, I feel, unfortunately, I believe we're about to see a resurgence of the virus, and already the caseload is climbing. So I think, if anything, it might have gotten some people's attention late. But I think some certain people who kind of disregarded it at the outset are now reluctantly being like, okay, I got to get on board. I just think it's a matter of acceptance. And, some of the countries that did better, well, they have more authoritarian regimes that can clamp down on their populace more directly. And I wouldn't trade living in America for living in a repressive regime for that benefit. But I do think that different ways of approaching it. An interesting example is how Singapore. It was, as somebody was telling me this, Singapore did exceptionally well with the coronavirus this go around. Well, it turns out the last coronavirus hit Singapore very hard. So they learned experientially the lesson, right? So when they heard that there was another novel coronavirus on the loose, well, they absolutely pulled together and took advantage of lessons learned in the previous pandemic, like 2002, 2003. So Singapore had great outcomes. I just think some people are late to learn, and I think, well, there are a host of things that play into why we might have not treated it as seriously as we should have. But I do think that we're treating it seriously now. I do think the fact that St. Jude does have a deep bench of infectious diseases experts, I do have, quite frankly, access to some of the most intelligent minds in the world on all these subjects, and they are convinced that we're on the right track. There are tons of clinical trials at work to figure out a treatment protocol. So I'm reassured by that. And, we've got the brightest minds in the world are trying to crack the code on this thing now. And from a PR perspective, quite frankly, I feel like I'm in a great position because like I said, we have such an incredible deep bench of infectious diseases experts, researchers, clinicians, et cetera, that I know, so for instance, a lot of people say, expert pitching is a PR strategy. Well, we're rolling out, even before we rolled out our infectious diseases experts proactively, we were kind of covered up in media requests because they've been relied on in previous flu seasons, for instance. So they know that that St. Jude is sitting on the treasure trove of really smart people on infectious diseases. I just think that especially and I don't relish the fact that we're going to have a fall dust-up. I wish it wouldn't happen. But I do think it will happen, and I couldn't be in a better position from a PR perspective because I know our experts will have something to say.
Well, I don't think you're going to have to wait until fall because without naming any of them, some of the states that insisted that they were going to open up when they did, it's beginning to come back to them and bite them right now. Yeah. And so a lot of folks are complaining. Some of the news folks have interviewed some of the younger kids who went to the beach and didn't do the social blah, blah, blah. And the lady says, yes, I didn't think it was important. I didn't pay attention. And now she regrets it. So I think some of the people who are not paying attention, had to be a 2x4, so to speak, pretty much got their attention, and now they're regretting it. So hopefully the other
I hate that it had to happen that way, but I think that's right.
But, unfortunately, it's everybody wasn't on the same page in terms of how not globally, but at least nationally this was handled. There were too many different playbooks running loose out there, so people decided who they wanted to listen to for whatever reason.
Right.
Let me ask you now, you're in Memphis. Did your local elected officials call on St. Jude to ask them to help plan and outline some strategies for dealing with this virus?
Our leadership has definitely been consulted by our city and county administrations, but we have been focused on first and foremost, job number one was and is safeguarding our campus, because we have a campus full of immunocompromised children. And the worry, especially at the outset, although I think this worry is receding, is that immunocompromised children would potentially be at higher risk for infection. So, like, job number one is to keep our campus coronavirus free. And so we've done all sorts of things to ensure that. One of those things, which has affect how I work as a PR guy, is that I haven't been on campus since mid-March. I've been working remotely, and I've been able to our entire communications team has been able to be incredibly effective using digital tools. But that's a way to safeguard the campus, because it's like, if you don't need to be on campus, why risk it? Now we're starting to see the ways that can work in terms of testing. I mean, keep in mind, we're a scientific institution, so like, we literally can turn right back around and run our own on-campus experiments, and that can teach us a lot. Our genomic scientists are sequencing the genome of the virus. What might we learn from that? So all sorts of fascinating and useful outputs from all that's happening. But yeah, no, job number one, and I do think that will ultimately help inform the world's understanding of what happened and what will happen in a really robust way. But yeah, from a practical standpoint, job number one is to protect our patients, our families, and our staff from infection, and then to play our wider role in Memphis to be a good corporate citizen and a good member of the downtown community, et cetera.
And I guess that pretty much begs the other question: because you are so well known for that, have other institutions such as the school system or the government, have they called on you to ask your guidance in terms of, here's how you guys are doing it, can you help us do the same thing so we can have positive outcomes?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. I will say this: the city and county have done a great job at following. I think they, like everyone, learned and adapted and have adapted their strategies. They are really basing their playbook on the CDC's guidelines. Now, St.Jude is a WHO collaborating center for flu research. So we are a globally relevant, center of excellence, if you will, on these issues. One of the ways that St. Jude is playing a role in informing the world is, and this has been the other thing that I've had great luck pitching as a PR guy, and that is St. Jude Global, our global team, set up a global COVID-19 observatory and registry for childhood cancer. So what we're doing is leading a global conversation about how the virus is affecting children with cancer. And we're basically convening a global conversation of oncologists, hematologists, pediatricians, and other healthcare workers to say, what has been your experience? Not just, and yes, they're sharing their data with us, de-identified, of course. They're sharing their data on the patients with cancer who have tested positive for COVID and what their outcomes are. Now, the good news is, they fared pretty well. They really have fared much like children who don't have cancer. So that's good. But also other anecdotal information that's come in and that's useful is, in us convening these global conversations, we've connected oncologists in China and Italy with oncologists in America and in Latin America. And Italy, imagine the utility in this. Places where the virus hit first, they learned some hard-fought lessons the hard way, right?
Absolutely.
So when they think to themselves, well, gosh, if I could have that to go back and do over again, I would have made sure that our so-and-so protocol was thus and so. Well, think how useful that is to countries in Latin America where, they are where we were in March. This is their March. So imagine your mindset in March when you're like, oh my gosh, this thing's taking over. Well, Latin America is really coming to grips with that right now. So how useful is it that the oncologists from Italy can be like, well, you're going to want to watch for this coming down the pike. And if I were you, I'd have your protocol for hand washing, utility washing, how you check in patients, any number of different functional hospital pieces. Wouldn't you love to kind of get the cliff notes from the people who've already been through it? And that's what our observatory registry is convening. And we're gathering all the data so that we can ultimately put out an academic report that says this is how the COVID-19 affected children with cancer statistically, right down to specific cancer types and treatment protocols. It'll be a really robust suite of information.
Well,
but obviously that's a great story to be able to tell. Right?
Well, not only that, but once you do put together, let's say, that guidebook for handling it, particularly for kids, is that you also have to have a receptive leadership. You mentioned,
yes.
South America. There are some places down in South America who still aren't giving it the sort of attention that is needed, and the population down there is suffering from it.
That's true. That's true. It does all come down to leadership, and whether it's reluctance, if people reluctantly accept it, or if they accept it eagerly. Like there's that continuum, right? And we just discussed how the U.S. had it was kind of a mixed bag, right? Well, I think other countries are the same way. Some respond better, and as is the case with Singapore, they really had the memo from almost 18 years ago. So they had an advantage going in because they knew about the severity because they'd been through a coronavirus outbreak in the past. But I think regardless of how soon or how late to the game you kind of realize this is serious, we got to act. St.Jude is just, we're playing the role of convener and so we're collecting a library of a curated set of the best literature that's the most useful for clinicians worldwide. And we're making sure that that's translated into every language that anybody would ever want. And we're just convening the conversation and the resources and gathering the data. So that's an example of kind of organizational leadership. Thankfully, St. Jude has grown to the level to where we have the bandwidth and the resources to go tackle a project like that. Not every organization has that bandwidth or that connectivity with the global research community like we have based on 25 years of plus of work out in the field. So it's in both instances, both the coloring book, suite of materials that our psychologists and psychologists did, and then the effort our global unit is standing up. It's a matter of institutional flexibility, giving rise to new things, being able to be flexible enough to say, wow, let's shift gears entirely and do something that's useful that we wouldn't have even known we needed to do 6 months ago or 4 months ago. And then PR is a really great discipline amongst the communication subdisciplines, if you will. We have to be the most flexible and the most nimble because the news cycle changes sometimes within the day, right? Within the hour. The focus can change because of something breaking on Capitol Hill or whatever. So whereas if you're an advertising person, think about the poor creative teams that spent months on an advertising campaign only to have the pandemic sweep it aside. But PR can be flexible. And so that's the reason it's best for PR to ride shotgun, most immediate shotgun on that kind of like institutional flexibility. And so I just had to, the old saying, like, take what the defense gives you, right? So it's kind of like you have to be responsive and nimble. And I had to realize, our psychologists and child life folks, like I literally got the placement in Forbes before we even gave a thought to, hey, should we write a press release about this? Like we literally never did because it was emerging. The news cycle demanded it. I knew it had utility, and I cobbled together a pitch, and out we went, right?
Well, one of the other things that you mentioned, having the flexibility and being nimble to be able to move is that still there are a few places who, when I say places, organizations that may question the value of public relations in their particular institution. So a lot of times people who know the PR people don't have a chance to speak directly to the top because there might be a layer there. So those things hopefully are dissipating quickly. Yeah,
and it is a conversation, right? Like when you're built when you're a swing for the fences PR guy like me, you want to size up an opportunity and go chase it, right?
Absolutely.
But in the early days of the pandemic, our leadership rightly hit the pause button and said, wait, let's take the time to think critically and let's not rush something out there. Let's think, what does the world really need to hear from St. Jude? And then with that pause, we then started to see what was starting to percolate up organically. And it was this coloring book. And I was like, oh, well, look at our psychology and child life folks being really creative and looking to do an extra good with a little bit more work. And then I was like, well, that would make a great story pitch. So then we consulted with our leadership, and our leadership said, oh, well, yeah, sure. I mean, that seems like it would have utility for children. Who wouldn't want that out in the world, right?
Well,
that was the very first thing that I was actually cleared to pitch. And then as time wore on, the more science-y stuff like our infectious diseases experts and speaking specifically about COVID, we had to be ironclad clear about whether or not our infectious diseases experts knew how to stop shy of conflating their expertise with influenza with COVID-19 because it's a brand new disease. And our leadership was right to pump those brakes. Our leadership said, let's make sure we've got that ironclad. And it took a minute for us to even think, well, what is the worry here about putting our infectious diseases people in touch with the reporter at the Atlantic? Oh, okay. You don't want them to overstate what we do. Okay, that makes sense. Well, then we did media training with the infectious diseases doc to say, here's the guardrail that we have to set around this, because we don't want to be pulled into speculating, because media outlets are just trying to get they're following down every interesting lead, right? As they should. But sometimes that means it's not a good fit, if it's something that's, in other words, you have to learn how to not overreach. And St. Jude doesn't have to be jumpy. We have the legitimate experts who really know a lot about pandemics, about infectious diseases. And it's we don't need to follow some speculative story and make some hunch or some guess. We can take a step back and say, here's the expertise that we can give you that will be useful to your story, and take it or leave it. And in almost every instance, they're like, no, that would be very, very useful. So for instance, there are these things called cytokine storms. And essentially, it's where your cytokines is what your immune system produces to fight infection. And an Atlantic reporter came in, she was studying this, and what she wanted was our infectious diseases experts to talk about this. So we were quick to say, we have all sorts of expertise studying cytokine storms as it relates to influenza. Would that be useful to your piece? Oh, yes, that would be useful. Of course, we don't expect you to know how cytokine storms are at work in COVID-19. It's a brand new disease. We're like, oh, okay, we can work with you on that. And it deeply informed her story. But we had to have that extra note of caution so that we could just be clear on the context.
Well, let me say, and one of the things that you mentioned in terms of leadership pausing to think your way through what our approach will be, I think is the right way to go, as compared to some leaders who sometimes, just want to pump the brakes on things for whatever reason. There are uncertainties about things. And I think that's a difference in terms of, who's effective, who gets more exposure, who's more respected, because you've taken, from my point of view, the right approach to think our way through the thing, but at least we get it done and we're comfortable with the way we're approaching it.
That's right. I mean, I have to just hats off to our leadership, but also it shows the strength of that internal dialogue, right? So it's communications professionals sizing up the opportunity, but having a dialogue with their leadership, understanding what the leadership worries are, and quite frankly, they're going to think through a problem in ways that are complementary to us, right? So we have more stereoscopic vision or depth perception, if you will, if we get colleagues around a table to say, what's the worry point here? And once we know that, then we can sit here and we can draw up the best play. So a lot of people think of PR overly simplistically as just the publicity machine, cranking out press releases. But PR people show their value in what in the kind of the guardrails that we set around things, the safeguards that we do, the media training that we do with faculty, so that they're aware of potential dangers, going into something.
Absolutely.
I think those are less appreciated, but nonetheless important.
Well, Marvin, I agree with you, and let me say that you have provided us with a wealth of information in our time here today. I'd just like to find out if you might have any closing remarks you'd like to make to the audience.
Oh, no, I just, honestly, it has been a very interesting time being a PR guy in the pandemic. We've had to learn the strength of flexibility, and this is, the whole world's crisis, so we've had to give ourselves grace, and we've had to be increasingly patient and bear with one another as we work through something that there really was no precedence for. But I think PR people are wired to thrive in that environment, and as I have a little bit of hindsight on what I've just lived through, I think that's certainly true of me. As awful as the pandemic has been, both in terms of lost lives and the damage it's done to our global economies, I, of course, lament that. But within that frame, I have to say that it has been not only fascinating, but there's been a really good part of the challenge to me as a professional. And quite frankly, I think not just PR people, but definitely PR people, I think we've learned some things, especially as it relates to digital tools and the usage of them, about just how flexible we can be. And, 2 years from now, or however long it's going to be for a return to, quote, normal, I think it'll be a different kind of normal, and I'm in hopes that we will maintain some of the lessons that we learned. And I hope that we maintain that forbearance a little bit beyond this as well. I mean, I think we realize that in a crisis, you realize how people are basically good and how people are kind and people want to work for the best outcome. And if we can kind of maintain a piece of that unity going forward and some of the tools that we've added to our toolkit, I think we'll be at an advantage as a profession and just as people.
Well, Marvin, it has been great to talk to you, and thank you so very much for, again, providing your wisdom and insights to the listeners of the Public Relations Review. And perhaps we'll have a chance to call on you again for if some other sort of health issue comes up. We'd like to be able to talk to you again to get your wisdom and insight.
It would be my pleasure. Yeah, call on me anytime. I've really, really enjoyed the dialogue.
Well, very good. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. And if you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review, and we look forward to having you join us for the next edition of the Public Relations Review.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies, an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, let me say thank you so much for being a listener. Now, I want to alert you to our shiny new podcast website located at podpage.com. However, you can go directly to the podcast site located at publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can contact me through email. You can leave a voice message. You can leave a review. You can read an episode blog and frequently learn about the podcast guests. You might also want to suggest podcast topic ideas or even suggest a guest. You can also let me know if you would like to receive our podcast listener logo that you can post on your social media. So I look forward to hearing from you about our new podcast website. Thank you so much for listening to the Public Relations Review podcast, and have a great day.